Hi folks, I'm Sam CHANDAN, the Silverstein Chair and Dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at the NYU School of Professional Studies. I'm delighted to be here at World City with ARSHA CAZAZIAN-CLEMENT, Director of Global Real Estate at Shearman & Sterling, and Jeremy Goldberg, Worldwide Head of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. The topic of our discussion for this part of World City is the future of the office. I can tell you that over the course of the last, well, a little over a year and a half now, there are very few topics in urbanism and real estate that have been more hotly debated and discussed than our return to the office. How will we return? When will we return? What will be the balance of working from the office as opposed to working from home? How do we think about the office and maximizing the value of that time that we do spend being physically co-located as an extension of this? Where we're working from and whether it is at the office has enormous implications for public policy, for all of the private sector functions that support office workers, whether it be the restaurant on the bottom floor of your building or revenues for the public transportation system. It's hard to believe that more than a year and a half into the pandemic, when we look at the numbers, we are probably not as far along in our recovery as people would have anticipated in the initial weeks of the pandemic. The Wall Street Journal in mid-October ran a story with the most current data that they have access to, describing how roughly a third of people nationally have returned to the office. What the article also hints at, and the data also tells us, is that there's tremendous variation by occupation, by location, and we're going to dig in on some of the drivers of those differences, what it means for not only the transportation system and that restaurant at the bottom of the building that I mentioned, but fundamentally, what does all of this mean for our urban cores in the United States and elsewhere in the world, in other global cities? So again, I'm delighted to be joined by ARSHA and Jeremy today for this discussion. Jeremy, if I can start with you, the Wall Street Journal did report just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, that the numbers are slowly improving, but we're still looking at occupancy levels in office space that nationally, are just about 1/3 of what we would normally expect to see. Why aren't the numbers higher? Is it because folks have figured out how to work very effectively from home, or how much of this is that folks are still nervous about coming back in?
Well, thank you, Sam. It's great to be here and great to be a part of this conversation. So I'd like to just begin with a bit of what my life was like before 2020, right? And I was living in Brooklyn, commuting into Lower Manhattan and Grand Central, driving to Albany weekly and spending a significant amount of time commuting, lots of hours, right? Commuting on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. And I think when we look at the situation in terms of what's happening today, I believe that remote work went from a relatively fringe experience for a lot of people to a common one, right, during the pandemic. But just as importantly, we saw that a huge number of cases in the public sector, for public sector employees and organizations, that they could actually continue their operations remotely in an effective way. And so with that established, offices can and should really move from being a place where work is supervised to a place where collaboration and truly necessary in-person work can happen. So I think particularly, when I look at it from the public sector lens, there will be a lot of negotiation and continues to be, I'd imagine, around contracts, on unions, civil service laws, and so forth, that really impacts the way it plays out in practice and what we're seeing right now in terms of the numbers that you're talking about. So this means that specifics are going to vary from place to place, city to city. And I think finally, it's really important to say that the pandemic's part is that this won't last forever, right? Working from home to avoid going into the public or to the office for health reasons is a very different atmosphere than a hybrid model that could allow for much more flexible working arrangements. I think especially during a time in which people are feeling fully safe and empowered to be in public spaces again. So there's a lot to learn from what we've been through and that we're still going through, but the future state is really going to look quite different.
Yeah, and I think your point's well taken that we want to maybe separate out. There are scenarios where, in a situation where folks aren't going into work because of fear, because of concerns around health and well-being. That being said, it's a trigger or potentially just a motivator for us thinking about and adopting new and potentially more effective ways of working together and collaborating. Longer term, it's not the fear of the pandemic that keeps us; it's that there's a balance that might make more sense with the technologies that we have available to ourselves than the model where we actually do go in every day. Arsha, you've pointed out that it's not a one-size-fits-all. What are the drivers of the variation that you're seeing in the way in which people are engaging in the workplace?
Well, so I mean, my background, my current role, I'm responsible for managing workforces across 5 different continents and 26 offices. And so it's truly not a one-size-fits-all in terms of how you address what has already occurred and then kind of our return to work strategies. And I will say the thing that I think every company is grappling with is, how do we ensure the happiness of our people as we try and figure out how to work through these challenges? And what's really interesting to me is that, attrition, the numbers are just, it doesn't matter the industry, but the attrition to try and wrap your head around it and craft a strategy, it's quite impossible right now to do. Everyone's throwing money at people to ensure that they'll stay. There's all kinds of incentives and packages that you offer to compensate for any loss of connectivity, physical connectivity with your fellow teammate in the company. But I think, generally speaking, I say it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because the other thing that we don't really think about is kind of taking a cross-section of the workforce within your organization, and everyone has a different set of resources and in their grasp, and everyone has a different living situation. Some have children, there's elder care that is anchoring people down. And so where I'm getting at is, yes, we can be more efficient at home when we're doing kind of the task-based stuff. And yes, everyone's talking about, let's bring people back to the office to start to build community and refresh or reset our culture. But the thing is that I think that the reset is far deeper than any of us are really ready to grapple with, which is, I think everyone's reevaluating who they are, their place in the world, what their value is, and if they like that job or that industry. And so I think it's an incredible period of reinvention. And I think that from a just purely real estate kind of portfolio perspective, we're looking at market trends. There are very specific industries that are occupying or keeping the numbers up in terms of signing new leases in cities. And they're not the traditional businesses, they're others. And I think that it's the reinvention of what you do in your day, I think is going to have a very direct impact on how companies structure their policies to support new talent that they have to attract.
Yeah, we are certainly seeing, in the macro data, a record number of voluntary quits, people leaving their jobs. And in part, it's because for skilled labor, the labor market is incredibly tight. And there is significant upward pressure on wages as a result. Part of what we're seeing in the dynamic, and you're working at an academic institution, I'm seeing this with our own students, the utility function across which they're maximizing certainly includes, where am I going to get the best salary, sort of, which place is, got sort of, the most prestigious, where am I going to learn the most, which is going to be the best for my long-term career. But there's this dimension that maybe I didn't really see so much before, which is, what is that, certainly sort of, what is the quality of the work life, but sort of what is that balance as well of going into work, working remotely, what technology and tools will be provided to me so that I can be sort of geographically autonomous, and that is a major part of I think what young people and folks across the spectrum are looking for. Jeremy, to Arsha's point about sort of this really dynamic period where we're thinking about how we reinvent how we work. was this inevitable? Was this going to happen anyway? And it's just that, 10 years of trends have been compressed into 18 months?
Yeah, great questions. I think the human dimension, the people-centered dimension of this is the part of it that I think that's come very much like kind of in your face over the past, 18 months. And in particular, something that our CEO, Satya Nadella, just said recently is that people will vote with their feet. And when we think about coming back to the workplace, we have to ask ourselves this question of, why were we working from the office, right? I mean, there are a lot of answers to that, some of which are around confidentiality, access to the office equipment, right? To that point around technology, the space, certainly, the trust, right? That's another component to this, that you can see people in person, right? If you don't see them, they're not working. And you can be closer to your customers. But I think mostly, in the public sector, at least, it's that's the way we've always done it. And so a lot of what's happening today around I think what is disruption, right, is especially in the public sector, is that I look at this from a kind of continuity of operations perspective, right? It certainly wasn't obvious that you could send public sector employees home en masse, especially on a short timeline, like literally overnight, like we did in 2020. And we learned during that time that we can, and that is really important for operational resiliency. So a real world example, is that the same equipment policies, let's say, that made remote work possible during the pandemic, allowed operations to continue more or less unaffected last winter during a couple of the snowstorms that hit the Northeast. So where in the past, employees would have either been struggling to get to the office, let's say, on a dangerous road or on the subway, or work would have just frankly grinded to a halt. So I think the new standard in terms of what's happening here and what's been driven by this disruption is that the operations are going to have to work that can be, and work that can be done from anywhere. So even if we see any major kind of public sector organizations, for example, fall back into the traditional patterns of office use, that's a major change. So these things will take longer to happen in the public sector for policy reasons. But I think the groundwork is now laid as a result of the disruption and the things that are happening as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, there was, to some degree, why did we go into the office before the pandemic? It's, on any given day, it's because that's what you do. But this has forced us to think much more carefully about, what is the value proposition? Clearly, there's a value proposition, but it's not everything that we do. We don't need to be there every day. But how do we really maximize the value of that physical co-location? I tell students that are graduating, do take the job where you have a chance to go in and meet people, because some of the things that you raised, Jeremy, your capacity to build trust relationships, to find a mentor, to find a champion for yourself within your organization. I believe, and I might simply be dating myself, but I believe you'll be able to develop meaningful relationships, a larger number of them, and deeper relationships if you actually meet folks in person, at least occasionally. And your point is also very well taken on, that snowy day. In 10 years, maybe just in 5 years.
Sure.
The students are going to give me funny looks if I talk about how we used to have snow days. It's going to be like 8-track tapes. What's a snow day? We're never going to have one again.
Right. Sam, technology has changed the office, right? Before, one of the biggest disruptions to the office, right, was the invention of the humble telephone, right? And so what was once done entirely by paper, right, could be done by phone in part. And so I think the office space, right, suddenly got a lot noisier, right? And people who were the more establishment and were veteran kind of leaders kind of scoffed, I think, at these sort of the phone and kept using couriers to send messages across a town, let's say. So I think the technology piece and the orientation will continue to kind of drive some of this and kind of see the opportunity to really, continue the disruption.
Yeah. So Arsha, I want to ask you about sort of the challenges facing the future of the office. I want to also ask you to talk a little bit about sort of the health and wellness aspects of this. But tell me also, sort of in those initial moments of the pandemic, were folks on your team, did you see folks outside of the team broadly being equally prepared? From a policy perspective, I worry about sort of the pandemic having exacerbated the digital divide. If you had a computer at home, if you have a high-speed internet connection, you were in great shape. But if you didn't have those things, you probably never felt more isolated in your whole life. What's your perspective on this?
I'll share two paths. I think my colleagues and I, so like other heads of real estate, again, like it doesn't matter the sector. Nobody had a policy in place. I mean, working remotely, there were special arrangements made, accommodations you call them, more legal terms, and there was technology that was a package that would be associated. But in terms of preparation, I mean, particularly in the legal industry, they are typically the laggards in terms of technology adoption. And the notion that you would be able to conduct or do business development or service a client, regardless of the type of law practice, was really unheard of to do it virtually. And so everyone scrambled. The summer was the time to start to bring in new leadership and subject matter experts that understood how to bridge the digital or the virtual and the physical worlds together, simply just to get the work done. Then the next layer was really addressing the great divide amongst the people within an organization. And every company struggled with this because there were the haves and the have-nots, and the haves and the have-nots that line became wider and wider and wider. And it was very unfortunate for organizations that weren't able to make the investment to then bring in programs or enhancement apps, engagement apps, or other platforms where transparency and sharing of knowledge could be almost in real time. And I think, from my perspective, I think that the winners that will come out of this are those that install new leadership that understand that that's vital. I also think that the technology adoption, I think everyone really understands that there are certain key packages or kit of parts one needs to be able to kind of bridge those two realms, home and office work. But then I also think there's a whole new layer where you actually have to care. And so this leadership style and management style, it has to change to be able to support and attract the type of talent that has the resiliency and the ability and the skills to be able to work in both worlds and really optimize those two very different experiences.
Yeah.
I know that was a mouthful, but it's complicated. You're dealing with human beings.
When you're thinking about sort of installing that new leadership that is able to leverage sort of newer models, what does the future office look like?
From a leadership standpoint or from a physical? I can answer both.
I think both are critical, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think those who are on the policy teams are key, and they are HR, technology, change management, real estate / workplace strategy, finance, anyone who's in kind of the client value or business development. All of those people need to be sitting at the table, and they need to bring their perspectives as to how they what types of environment or experiences they are going to put forth, and the technologies and the frameworks necessary to bridge both realms, the virtual and the physical, and to be able to articulate that and to look at the KPIs or the metrics or benchmarks that you were working against in the past to evaluate and to teach middle management to be able to manage current personnel and also attract new, and to be able to explain and provide the tools necessary to be able to do so. I think from a physical standpoint, I think offices are going to look very different. I know that in the legal industry, the financial industry, open office was not a popular thing. And now it's become unpopular again, this kind of open plan, because now social distancing is becoming important. So people want to be protected. However, I think that instead of looking at a typical floor plate and with perimeter offices and a core and maybe some amenities, I think people are going to start to be looking at furniture in a way that's going to allow to create neighborhoods. So it's almost like little 15-minute cities within each floor plan, so that you have everything that you need to be able to actually harness that level of connectivity with your teams. The problem is that companies are not all structured in teams. So the cross-pollinating will suffer. And I think it's all, again, not one size fits all, but I certainly think that there will be a whole new way of looking at the office, more for servicing a client, more for showroom or showcasing, and really and truly bringing together people that really have not been able to supplement community building or cultural building in their own homes or their communities.
Yeah. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this? What does the Office of the Future look like?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different things, right? I mean, in terms of the way that, and I like to look at this not only from the physical space, but as we look at it through the lens of, like, the cities and what kind of component in terms of the city centers themselves. And so, as I think the hybrid kind of work model becomes a bit more normalized as part of the landscape, I think, we will see, all parts of the city, whichever city maybe, evolve, and city centers will certainly change, right? They are changing as the cadence of travel, right? And mobility and commuting changes. So again, hybrid kind of work without the pandemic, right? Beyond the pandemic will mean a lot more people out and about, meeting in person and so forth. And to some of the points raised about the 15-minute city or the 5-minute city, I think it will certainly invigorate city centers from where we still stand today. But other parts of the city have tremendous economic opportunities as well. The outer boroughs, for example. And as people spend more time in, I think, what were traditionally residential districts because they are working from home, there are new opportunities in those areas, new opportunities for communities to form. And the same thing will apply, I think, to smaller offices and co-working spaces further from the center of the city. So as far as the public sector is concerned itself, it is one of the major employers in cities of all sizes. So it's really going to be challenged and likely a significant impact for big and small cities alike.
Yeah, so a dispersion of economic activity across the broader metropolitan area, because you don't need to be in the middle of that urban core every day. Arsha, I want to ask you about sort of for your thoughts on sort of what this future city looks like and how it relates to, and how much of it is being driven by our rethinking of the office. Before I do that, Jeremy, I mean, Microsoft is at the core of the technologies that have allowed us to work remotely. I think thank you. The pandemic would have been a very different experience for the world if we didn't have Microsoft Teams. But on the other side of it, I guess my question is, what in your view, what are some of the technologies that maybe we'd like to have to facilitate remote work that are missing?
So I think there are two ways I love to kind of talk about this. One is on digitalization, right, and digitization. So the digitalization pieces, right, this means that the changing of process, right, and practices, to take advantage of the digital ways that we work, right? This contrasts with digitization, which is really translating something, paper process oriented to a virtual form, let's say. And so I think the shift to remote work, as we think about the technology and the capabilities or the features that we want, right, the shift in the pandemic, has spurred more of the digitalization of the processes, so that the technology that we buy, Teams and other collaboration tools, so that you can make sure that you can continue to work from wherever you are, the processes on the back end and the back office side of the house have to be in place. And so in the public sector, government leaders, and this is speaking to electeds and agency officials alike, need to prepare to support the digitalization changes, right? The pandemic also showed us, that these changes can be made, and they can be made quickly when folks have the will and the need, or the crisis calls for it. So, but there's need for support from the leadership and the funding, of course, to go with it. And we have that time, we have that moment, especially in light of this U.S. infrastructure bill, if it ever gets passed here.
Yeah, Arsha, talk about this. I mean, what does this future office imply for the urban core? And I wonder if you'd even be comfortable speculating as to, do we ever get back to pre-pandemic levels of urban density during the day?
So I think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's made up of the same type of occupants. And I think that's what's really it's extraordinary opportunity, because this reset, while it's making tenants rethink maybe kind of how they work, it's also forcing a shift that it has been not addressed or solved, or capital hasn't made its way to this effort yet. And I think we have that opportunity. And what I'm talking about is, just decentralizing a CBD. There's lots of discussions around repositioning a lot of Class A offices and Class B, which make up most of Class B and C, which make up most of major cities, tier 1 and tier 2 cities in the U.S. To start, where those assets can be repositioned for essential housing. People use the word affordable housing, but perhaps it's essential housing or workforce housing that allows the distribution of wealth differently. And it can allow for the triggering of creating new revitalized commercial corridors in underserved areas in the outer boroughs. In order to do that, you need broadband. And oftentimes you have, most candidates who are running for mayor recently were all talking about the need for, the infrastructure in order to be able to support these programs. But no capital has actually been earmarked for that yet. And I think that, if there could be a united front with the largest anchor tenants in every major city to start to work with the private sector and shift that capital out and create hub and spoke models to support outer boroughs of the residents who were going to the CBDs to work, then you can start to look at new programs and create driverless and more walkable CBDs, which would then also introduce new opportunities and attract new industries. And so it's really rethinking what our cities could look like. I think from a density perspective, I think it might come back to the same numbers. It will just have those CBDs would serve a different purpose. And so I think,
and not to be too mundane about it, but I kind of like outdoor dining. Walking down the street and having people sitting outside enjoying themselves. There's this very European sensibility to it, and it's not quite as entertaining in New York, in January, but certainly over the summer it's been fantastic. But at the same time, I mean, are we going to have too much office space? And what happens to all this infrastructure that we already have that's designed and intended and was purpose built to get people to work every day? ARSHA, what do you think?
So I think it's a couple things. One, landlords are already major, I would say the REITs. So they're already rethinking what they do with their excess space. Or, I think the numbers are still showing leasing activity is not what it was before, pre-pandemic levels. So there's a lot of co-working modules being inserted into these commercial spaces. I think that's a good thing. But I don't think those co-working spaces are serving the existing tenants. I don't think you're going to have people commuting in from Connecticut to go co-work in a central business district. I think what it does do is attract businesses that otherwise felt that this was not accessible to them coming in from other cities. So now potentially there's an opportunity to, in Class A buildings particularly, to have these co-working modules, smaller spaces, 10,000 square feet, something like that, where you can start to bring access to businesses that otherwise would have looked at cities like New York or San Francisco or Chicago or DC, and give them an opportunity to grow their business. I also think the ground floor retail, there's lots of articles now where retail is being converted to, more traditional programs like libraries. Or any types of programs that have to do with health and wellness. And it would be really interesting to see if 50% of our CBDs that had retail converted to things that related to health and wellness. And everyone's definition of that, I think, is a little different. And I think that the local residents will have the ability to, they will want to commute there in order to be more part of a walkable city with programs that are also in line with, with their needs. So
we have just under a minute left. Jeremy, you're going to have the last word.
Oh boy, I guess I would say the last word. So don't fight the last war. That's I guess 5 words, right? There's still real problems to overcome, right? To beat the pandemic and provide people with the services and the support, to build back better. That's become cliche, but we can't be satisfied with just that. And I think if we focus just on, the challenges we face this time, right? This time around, we're going to fail miserably to prepare for the unforeseen challenges in the future. And so it's building with that flexibility and the innovation in mind, which I think will equal that kind of resiliency that we need the next time a crisis surfaces, and that we're better prepared, we're ready, and we're more embracing even faster, I think, for new models that keep people at the center of our approach and the work that we do in cities.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. ARSHA CAZAZIAN-CLEMENT, Director of Global Real Estate at Shearman & Sterling, and Jeremy Goldberg, Worldwide Head of Critical Infrastructure at Microsoft. I'm Sam CHANDAN, the Silverstein Chair and Dean of the Schack Institute at NYU. It has been an absolute pleasure discussing the future of the office with both of you, and my best to everyone attending World City this year. Hope to see you in person next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.